Okay, so are you ready to dive into some seriously heavy stuff today?
Always up for a challenge. What do we got?
Well, our listeners want to understand Adolf Hitler, the whole deal. So we're cracking open his Wikipedia entry.
Ambitious.
Right. It's one thing to have, like, the broad strokes, but we're going for the full picture here. Early life, rise to power, you name it.
And hopefully not just the what's, but the why.
Yeah.
That's what's so crucial, right? Understanding how someone like that comes to power. It's not ancient history. Those lessons matter now.
Exactly. So no pressure, but we're basically making this the go-to Hitler Wikipedia deep dive.
Well, in that case, we better do it right. Where do we even begin with a figure like Hitler?
His Wikipedia page is a beast, covers everything.
Yeah,
But they do go pretty in-depth on his early years, Vienna and all that.
always a good place to start, those formative years.
Right. And it's fascinating because you've got him as this, like, wannabe artist.
Aspiring is a generous term, from what I recall of his artwork.
Point taken. But also, get this, a huge E. Wagner fan. Operas, the whole 9 yards.
Oh yeah, that's not just a random detail. To understand Hitler, you got to understand the whole Wagner thing.
Fill us in. I admit, when I first read that, I was like, okay, random Hitler fact, I guess.
Nope, it speaks to the cultural soup he's swimming in. Wagner's operas, they weren't just entertainment. They were full of this, like, intense German nationalism, mythology, this whole glory days of the past vibe.
And that's important
Because this is Vienna, right?
Mhm.
Place was already a hotbed of anti-Semitism even before Hitler got there. So you've got this impressionable young guy already prone to extreme views.
And Wagner's music is basically the soundtrack.
Pretty much. It all feeds into this sense of, like, German identity and destiny, which obviously takes a very dark turn with Hitler.
Speaking of dark turns, the source doesn't shy away from the whole debate about his anti-Semitism. Like, when did it really become Hitler?
Yeah, that's a big one. Some historians say it was there all along, ingrained from childhood. Others think Vienna amplified it, that it was more about economic resentment at first.
And the source actually mentions that in Vienna, he, like, did business with Jewish people.
Yeah, which is one of those things that makes you realize people are complicated. Hate can be too.
For sure. So we've got failed artist, opera buff, exposed to this potent mix of nationalism and anti-Semitism. And then World War I happens. Talk about a turning point. What's the source highlight about that period?
Well, it's interesting because for all his later everything, Hitler was actually a decorated soldier in World War I, got the Iron Cross even.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, it really shows how the war, for all its horrors, could still be this, like, perversely formative experience. This is a guy who saw combat, knew what it was to be in the trenches.
Which makes the whole stab in the back thing even more.
Twisted. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the source even calls it paranoid. But that's the thing about conspiracy theories, right? They prey on vulnerability.
And post-war Germany was vulnerable as hell.
Exactly. Humiliated, economically devastated, people were desperate for someone to blame.
Cue Hitler, master manipulator.
Right. He didn't invent the stab-in-the-back myth,
Yeah.
but he weaponized it, used it to channel all that anger and resentment towards his own ends.
And that leads us nicely, or I guess not so nicely, to the rise of the Nazi Party.
Right. So we've got the beer hall putsch, that whole debacle.
Which, fun fact, the source says he basically planned using a ripped-off version of Mussolini's March on Rome.
Always inspired by others, that one. Of course, Hitler's little stunt lands him in jail.
Landsberg prison, which actually becomes, well, productive, to put it mildly. He writes Mein Kampf, of course.
Which, by the way, the source gives us actual sales figures for. By 1933, it had sold 1 million copies.
1 million. That's insane.
Not just insane, it's terrifying. Shows you how many people were buying into his ideology.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some fringe manifesto, it was a bestseller.
And prison gave him time to really solidify his whole thing.
Oh yeah, he had plenty of time to refine his arguments, write, and plot.
And build a following. Because when he gets out, it's not like he's starting from scratch. People were, for lack of a better term, fans.
Right, he's already got a platform. And then, to make matters even more volatile, the world plunges into the Great Depression.
Talk about an opportunity for someone like Hitler.
He was practically drooling. Germany was on its knees, people desperate, angry, looking for a savior.
And he was more than happy to step into that role.
Oh, absolutely. Promising to restore Germany to its former glory, blaming everyone but himself for their problems. It's a tale as old as time, unfortunately.
A charismatic leader, a vulnerable population. It's a recipe for disaster. But here's where Hitler's story takes an even darker turn, right? Because he doesn't just seize power through brute force, at least not at first.
No, he's much more insidious than that. He exploits the system from within, uses the very laws and institutions of democracy to dismantle it piece by piece.
Like a virus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the source does a great job of walking us through this process. We see the Reichstag fire, which, whether or not Hitler was directly responsible,
Let's be real, he probably was.
probably.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, it played perfectly into his hands. Created this climate of fear and chaos, gave him the excuse he needed to crack down on civil liberties, silence his opponents.
And then comes the Enabling Act, which is
Mhm.
just chilling. Basically handed him the keys to the kingdom.
Essentially, yeah. Gave him the power to enact laws without any parliamentary approval. He could do whatever he wanted.
It's terrifying how quickly it all happened.
That's the thing about the erosion of democracy. It's often a slow creep, a gradual chipping away at norms and values, until one day you wake up and it's too late.
Yeah.
And with the Enabling Act, Hitler's dictatorship was, for all intents and purposes, legal.
He had played the system and he had won.
And tragically, Germany and the world would pay the price.
And you're right, he really did play the system perfectly. But what's so fascinating to me is, the Wikipedia entry goes beyond just the big dramatic stuff like the Enabling Act.
Right? It's not just the greatest hits of Hitler's tyranny.
Exactly. It gets into how he really solidified his power. Like, they talk about his economic policies, how he was really focused on revitalizing German industry.
Which makes sense, right? People are hurting, they need jobs, they need to see things getting better.
Right. And a successful economy makes people a lot less likely to question, well, anything else that's going on.
Exactly. Economic anxiety is a powerful tool for any aspiring dictator.
Yeah.
And Hitler used it masterfully.
Totally. But they also talk about his use of propaganda, which, again, not exactly surprising for a dictator.
No, but what's interesting is the sheer scale of it. Hitler understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling the people. So he flooded Germany with propaganda posters, films, radio broadcasts.
Oh, and we can't forget the 1936 Olympics. Talk about a propaganda coup.
Hosting the Olympics was a huge win for Hitler. It allowed him to present this image of a strong, unified Germany to the world.
All while, systematically dismantling democracy and persecuting minorities. It's chilling how he was able to maintain this facade.
That's the thing about dictators. They're often masters of deception. They understand the power of image, of spectacle. And Hitler was a master showman.
Which leads us, of course, to World War II. And the Wikipedia entry does a decent job of summarizing the war years, but I was struck by how much emphasis they put on those early victories.
Yeah, the Blitzkrieg. Hitler's early military successes were nothing short of stunning. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, all fell in rapid succession.
It's easy to forget just how quickly and decisively those victories came.
It's true. And the source makes a good point that those early successes had a profound impact on Hitler's own thinking. He became convinced of his own genius, his own infallibility.
Which, spoiler alert, did not end well for him or, well, anyone, really.
Right. The more successful he became, the more reckless and delusional his decision-making became.
They talk about his micromanagement, too. Like, as the war dragged on, he became more and more obsessed with every little detail.
He couldn't let go of control, even when it was clear that his generals knew more than he did.
It's a classic case of absolute power corrupting, absolutely. And you can see how that, combined with his existing paranoia and prejudices, led to some disastrous decisions.
Oh, absolutely. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is a prime example. A catastrophically bad decision, driven in part by Hitler's own twisted worldview.
It's like the more power he accumulated, the more unhinged he became.
And the source even touches on the debate among historians about his mental state, particularly in those later years.
Was he clinically insane or just a megalomaniac drunk on power? I mean, it's a question we can't definitively answer, but it's definitely food for thought.
It is. And it speaks to the broader question of how power can warp even the most brilliant minds.
And of course, we can't talk about Hitler without talking about the Holocaust. And the source really doesn't hold back here. They call it what it was: a systematic, industrialized campaign of mass murder.
Yeah, make it very clear that this wasn't some tragic accident of war. It was a deliberate, meticulously planned genocide.
And it's easy, I think, to kind of distance ourselves from it because the scale of the Holocaust is just unfathomable. But the source makes a really important point.
Which is?
That it wasn't like this sudden explosion of violence. It was the culmination of years of, the hateful rhetoric, the policies, the persecution. It was a process.
Chillingly methodical, yeah. And it's easy to think, oh, we've learned our lesson, that could never happen again. But have we, really? I mean, look around. The world's still full of hate, full of people willing to exploit others for their own gain.
It's a terrifying thought, but an important one. Because, yeah, if we don't learn from history,
We are doomed to repeat it. So, after diving deep into Hitler, unpacking his Wikipedia page, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
honestly, the fragility of it all. Like, we think of democracy as this solid thing, but Hitler showed us how easily it can be chipped away, how a charismatic leader can manipulate people's fears and prejudices.
And before you know it, it's too late.
Exactly. So, yeah, I guess if there's one takeaway, it's that we can't be complacent. We have to be vigilant. We have to call out injustice wherever we see it.
Because silence, as they say, is complicity.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up for today.
As always, it's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this pretty intense deep dive. We know it's heavy stuff, but it's important stuff. So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.